The truth Winston Churchill carried into Yalta was not written on any map and not spoken aloud in any meeting. It lived in the quiet spaces between strategy papers, in the glances exchanged behind closed doors, and in the knowledge that a continent already broken by war was about to be broken again, this time at the conference table. In February 1945, when Churchill stepped out of his aircraft into the frozen Crimean air, he knew the world believed the Big Three were traveling to Yalta to shape the peace. But Churchill understood something darker. They were not shaping peace. They were dividing the ruins. Britain was exhausted. Germany was dying. And the Soviet Union, the same power Churchill had once called a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, was now the most unstoppable force in Europe. Millions of Red Army soldiers were already deep inside Eastern Europe. Poland, the nation whose invasion had begun the war, was no longer a country. It was a battlefield in the shape of a country, a graveyard with borders. By the time Churchill arrived at Yalta, Stalin's forces had taken Warsaw, installed their own provisional government, and quietly crushed opposition before the West could even respond. And that was the truth Churchill carried. Whatever was decided at Yalta, Poland's fate had already been sealed by force. He was furious. He was heartsick. He was trapped. Churchill had promised Poland independence in 1939. He'd vowed that Britain would protect it, restore it, honor it. But now, 6 years later, the British Empire had no soldiers left to send and no power left to challenge Stalin. So Churchill walked into the Leviata Palace with a terrible knowledge. If he warned Poland of what was coming, if he urged resistance, if he told them to reject Soviet control, they would die. All of them. Inside the conference halls, the atmosphere was suffocating. Roosevelt looked pale, drained by the illness he was hiding. Stalin sat still as carved stone, his eyes sharp, unreadable, cold as the winter outside. Churchill tried, again and again, to negotiate a free Poland. He demanded elections. He demanded transparency. He demanded dignity for a nation that had already suffered more than any other in Europe. But every time he spoke, Stalin responded with the same quiet, immovable reply: "Red Army is there." Those 4 words defined the entire conference. Red Army is there. Red Army is not leaving. Red Army decides the future. Churchill understood the message. Power decides borders, not promises, not treaties. Inside the polished halls of Yalta, maps were unrolled like shrouds. Lines were drawn with calm precision, lines that cut through history, through families, through entire peoples. Poland was shifted westward like a piece of furniture. Territories traded like currency. A nation amputated to satisfy a fragile peace. And Churchill, the man who had sworn to never negotiate with tyrants, found himself making a silent calculation. If the West fought Stalin now, Europe would bleed again, and this time there might be nothing left to save. So he made the choice that he would judge harshly, but he believed the alternative would drown Europe in fresh blood. So he kept silent. Not because he didn't care about Poland, but because he knew that warning the Poles would ignite armed resistance against an enemy too vast, too entrenched, too merciless to defeat. Resistance would not save Poland. It would only bury it deeper. In private moments at Yalta, Churchill walked the palace corridors alone, his cigar burning low, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of decisions he had no power to change. He had saved Britain from the Luftwaffe. He had stared down Hitler when the world was collapsing. But here, in the final months of the war, Churchill faced something he could not defeat: the brutal mathematics of survival. Poland could fight, Poland could resist, Poland could die bravely, but Poland could not win. So Churchill made the choice that history would judge harshly, but he believed the alternative would drown Europe in fresh blood. When the conference ended and the agreements were signed, Churchill boarded his plane with a silence heavier than any document. He knew what the Poles would say, he knew what the world would say, he knew what history would say. He had betrayed a friend. But he also knew what the war had taught him again and again. Sometimes a leader must choose not between good and evil, but between tragedy and catastrophe. And in February 1945, Churchill chose tragedy. He chose a Poland wounded, not a Poland annihilated. He chose a Europe divided, not a Europe in ashes. He chose a fragile peace over another war that the West could not survive. Years later, when asked about Yalta, Churchill simply said, "The position was hopeless." Not dramatic, not self-defending, just the quiet truth of a man who had carried a burden no speech could justify. Because the truth Churchill carried into Yalta was the one he carried out with him. He could not save Poland. He could only save Europe from something even worse. And that is why Winston Churchill did not warn Poland about what was coming. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much to let them choose a death they could not escape.